Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with the topic Navigating Changes in Regulated Software Environments. My name is Laércio Fernandes. I'm a Product Marketing Manager at Thermo Fisher Scientific, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots and brought to you by Thermo Fisher Scientific. To learn more, visit thermofisher.com/Chromeleon. We encourage you to participate today by submitting any questions you may have during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. We will answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. And also, if you experience any technical issues, you can utilize this Q&A box and we will assist you directly. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Joe Ault, the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Thermo Fisher Scientific. And for complete biographies on our speaker, please visit the Biography tab at the top of your screen. Joe, you may now begin your presentation.
Thanks, Laércio. Appreciate everyone joining us today. My name is Joe Ault. I will be discussing how to deal with making changes to regulated software and kind of what considerations you should make. Also covering some new guidance that's come out and just trying to sort of demystify what can sometimes be a bit of a complicated process. So with that, today we're going to cover what typically we look at when we do an upgrade to an application, the usual approach that is done, and then something it's a bit of an alternative approach. This isn't sanctioned per se by Thermo. It's more just for your consideration as you kind of adopt a critical thinking modality and how you want to think about upgrading your application, and where you might be able to find some advantages to some existing processes and some existing knowledge you have within your organization that can help you out there and make this a little simpler. There's a new concept called computer software assurance by the FDA that's come out somewhat recently. Conventionally, people followed computer system validation, or CSV, and I'd like to talk a little bit about a strategy to use CSA to make this process a bit simpler. You'll hear this talked about a lot if you think about doing any kind of upgrade or implementing software using a risk-based strategy. And so just want to cover kind of how we think about that in a very qualitative way. It may align with what you're already doing, or it may give you some insight into how to start to adopt that for your own processes. And then finally, the need for continuous monitoring of your application over its life cycle. With that, we need to look at why anyone does make an upgrade to an application, right? We all have a lot to do for our day-to-day jobs, and this just adds more work typically, right? We already have an application we're using, and it seems to be working fine. So what is the justification for even doing an upgrade in the first place? There are a few that we tend to think of. So probably the easiest one to think about is to bring in new functionality for an existing business process. So you've kind of gone to a show, talked to some colleagues, and found out that there's new functionality that could help your business process, and you would like to implement that, or someone within your business has come up to you and kind of requested to do that, right? This is happening more and more and more. So conventionally, we think about applications being what we call on-premise or on-prem, and that means that they were hosted in a server that was physically located on the site. But that trend is changing. A lot of things are now hosted in a cloud, right? So no longer with infrastructure on site. So if you have legacy applications that are hosted via on-prem infrastructure and moving them to the cloud, there may be considerations to do an upgrade to do that. And there may be some other reasons too. So you'll hear a lot about data integrity and security concerns these days, justifiably so. So if you're thinking about risks that you may have to your business based on the way your application is configured, you may need to make an upgrade to alleviate that. So for example, if you're thinking about changing your access control, depending on what app you're using, you certainly would log in with a username and password. If you're familiar with many other things you may use, not in a regulated business, in a pharmaceutical space, you'll often see two-factor authentication used, and that's what this is, multi-factor authentication. So that technology is there to give you an additional safeguard. And typically that kind of technology for regulated applications will follow after it's a little more robust. So if you're bringing that in, that may be a justification as well. Additionally, at Thermo, we think of moving from a smaller instance of an application to a larger one. So if you have a small lab and you have a single, what we call a workstation controlling several instruments, and now you're looking to upgrade that same system to control many instruments, perhaps across different labs, across different sites, that may be justification to upgrade too. So when we upgrade, we have a few goals to consider. First off, we have an application that's already qualified for its intended use. And then we make the upgrade. Well, we want to make sure when we do the upgrade that the application remains qualified for its intended use. Otherwise, we're degrading our qualified state and giving ourselves more problems than we solve by bringing the upgrade in. So when we think about how to ensure that the app remains qualified, we want to focus our effort on the aspects that do affect the intended use. And we want to follow a risk-based process to do that. So if we think about what the intended use is, if we think about a car, right? So there's many forms of cars. You can have a typical sedan, a truck, or a bus. Each one kind of has a different form, right? But it does something similar. It moves people and things to their destinations. In the same kind of way, if you have an application, it may be a laboratory instrument control system. That we make those and market those at Thermo. It may be something for supply chain management. It may be something for your quality management system. But they all do have a similar core function, which is they produce data that's going to help you market and or sell your pharmaceutical or your medical device, right? And they need to do that in such a way that that they ensure the data is consistent and the data is reliable throughout that process, right? So when we focus on the intended use, we need to think about what's common for all our applications. And this is not to be an exhaustive list. It's just a little bit of a thought exercise. So the first thing you would always do for any application is you log in, right? Which is authentication. The next thing, when you log in, you will receive permissions that are conferred to you based on your role, right? So we think of that in terms of user management. There's different ways to say it, but essentially you configure an application so that when someone logs in, they're assigned a role and a set of permissions, right? And that'll happen regardless of what the application is doing. Then you do the intended use, right? Which oftentimes that's data processing, or you're collecting some sort of information, or you're transacting something. But that is really kind of why you have the app, what it's intended to do, right? And so then you report your data, of course, and then you maintain the record, right? You make sure that the record stays protected over time, right? Which is really important. So if we think about that back in terms of having a car, right? A car has kind of the same parts, right? It has an engine, it has a body, it has a transmission, it has wheels. Each one of those is necessary for the car, right? But if we think about, we're just upgrading our tires, right? Think of that maybe lining up with, we're changing permissions here, right? We want to focus on the aspects of what we did for our requirements around the permissions then, or around changing the tires, right? We wouldn't necessarily be concerned with, did we mess up any of the windows if we just change the tires, right? So that in the same way, you want to think about your application in such a way that you understand where you are in what the application is doing, and that kind of helps you define your intended use. So the typical process for doing an upgrade kind of looks like this. So you would review the vendor's release notes. So when we make an upgrade to our applications, we submit release notes, and they tell you what we did and what functions that entailed and what it changed, right? And then you take those same notes and you review them with your business area to figure out what features are going to be used. If you're in a regulated space, you'd open a change control, and then you do some measure of risk assessment to figure out which features are going to be used and how much testing is required to implement those features. Then you, depending on what your risk assessment kind of tells you, you do some level of scripted testing to show that when you update that application, the features you brought in work as intended, and as necessary, some regressive testing to show that the existing features still work as they should. So doing that, of course, requires time, right? So it either requires time of the people who use the system for its intended use, the existing system personnel, or you have to bring in, and this is pretty typical, someone from the outside to get this work done, which costs money, right? And then after that's done, you make sure you update the procedures that guide you how to use the application, and you verify the effectiveness of the same procedures through user acceptance testing. So you take the actual user, the actual procedure, and you run that through the process and make sure you get the outputs as designed. And if not, you figure out what the issue is, whether it's part of the procedure or part of the configuration that didn't work out correctly. Once everything is correct, you close the change control. Again, that's the typical process, but there are some kind of obvious downsides to that. So one, assuming that you can do that assumes continuity of personnel to reaffirm the initial baseline. And that's a bit wordy, but what it means is, as your personnel within your business change, your perspectives on how much rigor something needs to be tested with can change based on the staff you have, right? If you think about upgrading an application for a pharmaceutical, the time cycle is usually on the order of maybe 2 to 5 years or so. 2 might be a little optimistic, so let's just say 3. If you think about the nature of people coming and going from your organization, it may be that the same people who were involved when you initially qualified an application are no longer there, right? Or maybe if you're the person tasked with leading this, you weren't there, right? And so you're looking into what someone else may have done, right? And so the perspectives may have changed there. By the same token, it requires subject matter expertise to understand what the application does, how much the upgrade impacts it, and what to do about that. And across any application in an organization, typically you'll have differential understanding of that application based on how long the users have been there, how proficient they are with the application, and that can impact how the upgrade is processed and how it's defined a bit, which isn't really very good, right? We want to be consistent across applications that are all following the same regulations. So the existing process is just inefficient, right? So if we're trying to do a collective critical thinking exercise, getting everyone together is actually harder than it sounds, right? You hear a lot of times, just get everyone together and make sure you do that. But just trying to find the time, especially if you're in a global organization, to get everyone aligned isn't very easy. And then to have them participate in an actual critical thinking exercise, so have them do the advanced preparation so that those sessions are actually productive, is a lot more difficult than it looks from the outset. Another important thought is when we think about conventionally upgrading, so if we're looking at the release notes and then we're determining what we're going to use, we're starting with an assessment of the application itself, but we're actually trying to make sure that we follow the regulations, which say we qualify and verify the application for what its intended use really is. So we're not looking at the intended use, we're looking at the app instead. The other aspect is, again, risk assessment is a good tool, but it's not a very good reflection of intended use. And the reasons for that are kind of twofold. So one, either we say, and we do a system level risk assessment that says all of this application should be considered GMP and therefore should be qualified. So it's a very monolithic look. We're not looking at discrete functions of the application. Conversely, though, if we look at a functional risk assessment, which does look at discrete functions, it's too prescriptive. It's only looking at each function in isolation, and it's not looking at how they holistically work together, right? So it kind of goes from both ends, but it misses the middle a bit. The other thing is risk assessments themselves can be fairly biased. So typically an end user wants to adopt all the features with the minimum effort from their part, right? They just need it to work and work quickly, and they don't really have a lot of time to manage that. And so they'll classify everything as low risk. But on the opposite side of that, if the QA organization will be much more conservative and declare the same features as high risk. So there's the difference there of kind of understanding how to qualify and how to assess the risk. And I think with that, I've received a couple questions that have come in. So I'd like to take a break and kind of talk through some of the questions, and then I'll get back to questions that have come in. So I'd like to take a break and do some of the questions, and then I'll.
All right. Hi, Joe. We can see that a few questions already came in. So, can you maybe discuss any strategies to improve the conventional approach to upgrades? Like, are there any revisions to existing regulations that we can follow to improve the process? And another question that we also got is, I've heard a lot about using a risk-based approach, determining the amount of effort involved to requalify an application post-upgrade. So can you provide us with an example of such approach?
Okay, sure. So when we think about, answering both of those questions, what could we do in a more innovative way? How could we improve the process? And then also, how can we take risk into account as we do that, right? We have a few slides upcoming where we cover that. And then, of course, if there are any more questions to that effect, when we conclude the presentation, I'd be happy to answer those too. So when we think about improving, we need to look at where the regulations are going. And in some cases, in the case of CSA, computer software assurance, the FDA is trying to move closer to working with vendors and with those who provide any services or actually, create the products that patients use, right? So, and what they're doing is saying, they've found that conventionally upgrades were not done because that the process to do an upgrade was so difficult and so time and cost intensive that companies would just not do it, right? Because they were trying to follow kind of old guidance and use scripting modalities that were just too difficult to do. And so the net effect of that, sadly, was that these new technologies were not getting to users and getting in such a way that they could actually be beneficial to patients, right? And so the FDA realized that and said, what can we do to make sure that we maintain patient safety, but also allow upgrades to happen easier? What can we look at? And what they come up with is something called computer software assurance. And you'll see this quote here from Daniel Walther, because it's often misunderstood that verification of software needs to take place by formal scripted testing. And that's not the case. So the idea is that you can incorporate risk. You'll see the word higher risk here. And those sort of features should be verified by what's termed robust scripted testing, which is the traditional way most people think about doing testing. However, low to medium risk features can be verified by a limited scripted testing or a hybrid method, which takes into account conventional scripting, but also other modalities to think about making sure that the features are properly verified and the existing intended use is also maintained. And so, again, this is just for your consideration. This isn't to be intended as a prescriptive way that Thermo Fisher is declaring to do this, right? It's just a bit of a thought exercise. So when we think about using a revised approach and incorporating limited scripted testing, we need to look at first, as opposed to reviewing the release notes of the vendor and saying what is new, we need to think about what attracted us to making the upgrade in the first place. The earlier points I touched on about why we were doing it in the first place, and think about what those are, and then update the existing configuration of the application in a development or a sandbox environment to enable exactly that functionality, right? So basically make the upgrade, but do it in your sandbox. Then run the current process, so what the system is intended to do, right? And to do that, the suggestion is to use your existing standard operating procedures and work instructions and just go through them and see where they still work or if there's things that need to be revised, right? And then also run the previous user acceptance test scripts that you used when you initially released the application and focus on anything you customized, so away from just the standard configuration from the vendor and any reports that you've configured. While you're doing that, then the suggestion is to redline the procedure. So if what we're saying here is that anything you're implemented has already been fully tested by the vendor in their commercialization process. So you're bringing it in, you're changing your existing configuration. Now you're taking your procedures and you're working through them in such a way, and you're seeing what needs to change. So if it needs to change, you use the redline process to do that, right? The idea being, if a step in the procedure is successful and you don't need to redline it, then the feature is already confirmed to be addressed by the intended use, right? So as you validated the application or verified the application, you should be covered there, right? Because you did so previously thinking about your intended use. And now you're using the procedure that you use every day to run the application, and you're showing that it still works as intended. If you have to, conversely though, if you have to redline the procedure, then the addition of that feature impacts the intended use. So a bit of a simple binary here, right? And so taking the items from step 2 here, where a redline is required, those are the things we want to carry forward for a risk assessment, right? Because now we know those impact our intended use, 1, and 2, they're not already addressed by our current validated state, right? So that becomes, we're kind of funneling things in such a way that we see now this is the intended use of our application with the update, right? And so we do a risk assessment there. And then we verify the high-risk features through robust testing. The other thing we do then, everything that hasn't been graded to be high risk, we use this limited approach. And our limited approach would be we rerun our SOP, work instructions, user acceptance testing to confirm that the functionality now works. So this rerunning assumes up in step 4 that we've done these red lines, right? So we've taken the existing procedures and we've made these changes to them to reflect how the system should work. Now we run them again to make sure that they work as intended, right? And that's kind of it, right? Because now we've said, okay, now we've configured it and we're sure that when we run it every time, we'll get the same output as desired. So this does have a few assumptions that I need to cover. So 1, this covers a lot of the type of applications we make here at Thermo Fisher, which are considered to be configurable off-the-shelf or COTS applications. So the idea being that they're not custom coded for any customer, right? They're made for representative customers, and there's no code involved. There's configuration of the application itself that is reversible and can be set. And so that's an important consideration here. Also, we're talking about an upgrade. So if you haven't already upgraded, or you haven't, pardon me, if you haven't already validated the application and released it to production, this model doesn't work very well, right? You can't just start from nothing and only focus on the change, right? You would have to have the existing application validated itself. You heard me mention user acceptance testing. So if you have those scripts, this model works. If you didn't do that previous, then you would have to rethink another way and what existing procedures you may have. And this is important too, that your standard operating procedures, work instructions have been maintained and are current. So if you're not updating your working procedures, then you really can't use them to substantiate this approach. I should add, regardless of any kind of upgrade, that's not a good approach, right? So any good configuration management scheme will make sure that you update your procedures over the life cycle, right? That's very, very important. So earlier we talked about that when we do risk assessments, we can fail to be really objective, right? One way we can increase objectivity here is we're not making it so subjective. We're not asking various experts from where they sit the risk of something, right? We're just taking an existing procedure and running it, right? So the procedure exactly states how the app should have been used previous, and we run it again and see if it still works, right? So there's no bias in that from any perspective, right? The other thing is, over the life cycle of the application, we're getting more information now too, right? So if we're continuing to use a process like this over the life cycle, we can see from this version of the user acceptance testing we ran to the next version and so forth, and we can link that back to how we originally defined the risk for the application, right? This man, earlier turn of the century, created a fairly few popular magazines and so forth. And his comment here is basically that anyone in themselves, it can't be objective, right? It's very, very difficult to be objective about anything by ourselves, right? And so to work through that, we need to think through who are the stakeholders of any upgrade, right? So we would always have conventionally what we think of as the application user themselves, who defines the intended use, quality assurance, who makes sure the app is in compliance with the regulations. And this is important too, and sometimes not always considered, the project sponsor in the first place, right? So who has defined the timeline and the resources, right? Because all of that contributes. And we have to bring the inputs of all those stakeholders forward to make sure that our verification is robust. So hopefully that answers the question about kind of a more innovative approach, or just a different way of looking at it to kind of add some critical thinking. Secondarily, just like to give an overview for how to conduct a risk assessment of a qualified application. And so first, we want to define a process for calculating risk. Even if it's qualitative risk, we need to have some consistent process for doing that. So to do anything, we need to measure the risk itself. We need to determine if what we're measuring is in scope, and then we need to produce what we call a risk rating that guides the level of verification required. And so there's a few steps to this. So initially we measure the risk, and a lot of you are probably familiar with something similar to this. So the initial measurement of declaration of risk, we try to put it kind of in this stoplight model, with the addition of none here, but low, medium, high, essentially. And we kind of say, if this doesn't work properly, how much does it hurt? How much does it impact our product? And therefore, then how much could it potentially harm a patient, right? And should be fairly self-explanatory, right? But this is, again, where the entire team that understands the process you're doing, the molecule you're creating, and how it's consumed, needs to be involved in this, right? For thinking about bringing that risk forward for a qualified application, the way we think about qualifying applications is based on verifying the requirements of the application. So we have various requirements around what I kind of shared earlier about authentication, about the configuration, about the overall process that any user does, about how to report any data that's created, and how to maintain the data. And there'll be requirements around all of those, and they should be fairly consistent across applications for your business. And so our suggestion here is to look at this in terms of that context, right? And say, if they're covered by a requirement, then such as if we have a role and we're just clicking a checkbox to add a privilege that was already verified, right? So what we're saying there is it was already checked in our initial testing, then it's very low from this standpoint. If we're doing something new though, and we're making a slight modification, then we may want to consider that partially covered. That's always a bit nebulous, but that's kind of some definition of partial. And versus we're making a change that we don't have any sort of requirement for. Right? And so essentially, then what we do is layer those two things together to produce a risk rating. So you'll see if we have kind of our low, medium, high, covered, partially covered, not covered, we get this risk rating system, right? And we use this to then guide our customers to determine how much verification is required based on kind of looking at that sort of CSA model that I shared earlier. it wouldn't be appropriate for me to say how that works for any given customer's application. So the idea here is that you can kind of take this and see how this aligns to your own processes and see how much agreement you may have, right? But as you might guess, the idea is at the lower end, we would have to do little to no verification to adopt a feature, versus where we fall into that kind of 5 corner. That would be the more conventional, robust, scripted testing, right? We have something that is very dangerous to a patient, possibly, and we don't have an existing requirement. So we don't have any mitigation strategy there, right? So again, that's just for your consideration. Other things to consider when we think about upgrading applications over the next few years. So the PICS working group, and essentially this is the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, of which a lot of regulatory authorities are members. So FDA, MHRA, and others as well. They're looking at doing inspection reciprocity. So they're, in fact, they're looking at a risk-based approach to making sure they can use the limited amount of inspectors they have to make sure that products that are on the market globally are actually properly assured, right? That the companies making those products are following the correct regulations. And so they're promoting a forum to do that. So there are some considerations that, given that, regardless of where you're operating, knowing that if you're operating under one regulatory body, you may be used to following just their advice, but you need to kind of take into consideration the overall harmonization of that too, and where that should lead you. So a really good one to look into is the European Medicines Agency, because they make their guidance such that it's fairly digestible. It's not kind of so high level that you can't really understand sometimes what the point they're getting to is. And so coming forward in early 2026 will be an amendment to Annex 11, which is their guidance for how to use computerized systems in compliance with GMP. And one of the things they're mentioning now is data in motion and data at rest. So conventionally, what I was describing before is authenticating through reporting of data is essentially data in motion. But data at rest means when we back up a data, archive it, we move it off the system, we still need to keep that data because it's required for the product on the market. We need to have some differentiation between those two states. Also, as we kind of shared earlier, because so many services are more moving into the cloud, services should list how to operate a computerized system. So if you're hosting things in a cloud service, that needs to be spelled out more explicitly. And to add to that, previous it was okay for a customer to say, we have a supplier quality agreement with our cloud provider, and they do the actions necessary that we would have done had we hosted the app on-prem. Right? This guidance is essentially saying that's not going to be enough going forward. We need to make sure that any of the validation effort that would have happened for the on-prem system is happening for the cloud-hosted system, and that the company who's purchasing the services of the cloud vendor has access to that documentation for their own quality management system. We're also looking a little more at challenging which parts are critical of the systems to make and making sure those are validated, and anything that is automated. So more and more features are being automated, and making sure that that aligns to the user requirements for the system itself, and that has been properly verified. As I kind of shared before, when we talk about kind of data at rest, we're thinking about what is covered by a backup. So is it just the produced result? Is it the application? Obviously, without the hosting application, if you have a data file, you won't be able to read the data, right? So the idea being that you have both the lock and the key there to make sure you can reproduce that as necessary. And then also how backups are made, where they're stored, how frequently, and so forth, needs to be spelled out more clearly. This is a rule that's a bit near and dear to anyone who uses our systems. and it's called the least privilege principle. And it essentially means, as I shared before, if you log into a system, you are conferred permissions based on a role. It's not always such that one user has only one role, though. Oftentimes, for business purposes, a user will have different roles. So, and each one of those roles will have a different set of permissions. It should follow then that one of those roles will have lower permissions than the other. What the guidance here is saying is, by default, you want to make sure, if that is the case, that you have multiple roles, that when you log in with the least privilege role. So you don't actually perform an action that you shouldn't have done for normal routine use. So you want to make sure that that elevated role has to be accessed differently. It's just a bit of a check, but it's an important thing to point out. And the concept of configuration review. So looking at the changes that are made over time. So not just doing a thought process of we're changing this from X to Y, but moreover how that baseline is looked at over time. And if you recall, when I shared looking at your user acceptance testing over time, you're getting a bit of a tool to do just that, right? You have kind of a, not just the application changing from how the vendor declared it, but you actually have how you within your own business are understanding how you use that application, and therefore you have an audit trail there that can give you some guidance to do this configuration review. So this is just a quick crosswalk of what's changing in some of this guidance. And you can see that, and the reason I bring up this slide is to show that effectively they're fairly closely aligned. And where they are not aligned, typically they will be, right? So it's not so much to say I'm only following this principle versus the other one. You really need to make sure that you're looking at following the requirements of both, and in so doing, you're kind of meeting both masters, if you like. The other thing to consider, and especially as we move into more cloud-hosted spaces, is supplier quality management. So this is true of any sort of app, but again, if you're using one that is hosted in the cloud, now you're relying on the availability of that vendor to make sure the application is in fact available to you, right? So when you think about that, you want to make sure that they have the right quality system that meets your own needs. So are they ISO certified, right? Are they following these sorts of things? Something else to think about that maybe isn't such a strong consideration or typical consideration of people in the compliance space is how financially viable is the company? If they're fairly new and they're looking to grow an application, will they be there over time for you, right? Because if they're not, you can imagine if they should no longer be there, how does that impact your existing business process that you've set up to deal with that, to use that application, right? You'd be in some trouble there. So it's a very important thing to look into to make sure that you're confident in your supplier over time. Also, when we think about making an upgrade, there's a few bits of documentation that should be pretty standard that we look into. So user requirements specification, again, this kind of determines how the system should be used based on what you're trying to do with it, right? And electronic records, electronic signatures assessment gives a different look at the system, but what you're doing there is saying, where can we implement technical controls based on what the vendor has provided us, and where do we need to have an internal procedural control to make sure we're completely following the guidance, right? And then the system configuration specification, different words for this, but what I was talking about before about doing kind of a configuration baseline over time, right? This is your static master data that you load into the system that sets the parameters, that sets the permissions that users will get. And you need to look at kind of what just changed when you make that upgrade, right? So when we think about user requirements, typically we think about operators being users, but that's not necessarily true. So we want to think about the different business areas that are users of the data produced instead. So quality control generates that data, reviews it, so does quality assurance, but that data may go downstream to manufacturing as well. And IT may need to consume that data and make sure they can properly support it over time. All of those business functions need to be kind of brought into defining user requirements for an application. as I shared, this is a look of how we do an electronic records, electronic signatures assessment for one of our applications called Chromeleon. And you can see this is, again, a bit of a crosswalk where we have sections of Part 11 from the FDA, Annex 11 as well, and we kind of have the common question that each bit of the sections are getting to, and we explain where we have built the application as from our own perspective, right? In such a way that you can enable these controls as a technical control to make sure you're following the guidance. Of course, this is as we design it at Thermo, and ultimately responsibility for this lies with each customer. But it helps to advance and accelerate kind of where you're going to do this. And when you make an upgrade, you need to revisit this sort of assessment just to make sure that you haven't made any changes. As I shared, you also want to look at your system configuration specification baseline. Again, this is representative of what we consider important things to control in a master data sense for Chromeleon, right? And so where we would set these things, and these would be held under change control, we look at what is in each one of these aspects to understand what we're changing and how we need to declare that for our change control process. The other thing we need to do as we have an application after we've upgraded it is to make sure we're always monitoring it, right, over its life cycle. It's not enough to just say we initially installed it, we verified it, and we started using it, and we were happy with it, and then eventually we want to make an upgrade, and we kind of repeat a lighter process of our initial install and verification, and we're happy with it again, right? We need to make sure that we're adding between those two markers an additional process to make sure that we're maintaining compliance, essentially, right? So again, looking at kind of configuration review, the goal here is that rather than have an auditor tell you what may not be done properly, if you're doing a self-inspection, you're finding those things out within your own business and you're mitigating them, right? So you're drawing down the risk that anything could happen to the product you're making for a patient, right? You're documenting that, you're assessing it in the same way that I kind of shared before, using that kind of risk rating system, doing any verification that you need to do, and then modifying any of the supporting documentation to make sure that stays in compliance too. And the goal there is when you do that, you maintain compliance of your application. That concludes the webinar I wanted to conduct with you today. I really appreciate everyone joining, and I'd be happy to take any additional questions anyone has.
All right. Thank you, Joe. That was a great presentation. We now begin the second Q&A portion of the webinar. And we have lots of questions that just came in, so let me just have a look. And by the way, if you haven't already submitted any questions, please do so now. If you just go and click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen, you'll be able to submit your question, and we'll answer as many questions as we have time to do so. So let's get started. Our first question is, Joe, does Thermo Fisher offer professional services that can help our customers with upgrades?
Hey, Lars. So yeah, we sure do. And I think we'll provide some information for anyone attending the webinar, how they can reach out to our teams. But yeah, we have all around the world professional services that can help initially launch applications and get them installed and do validation services with them too. And we're happy to support that in any way our customers need.
Right. Thank you, Joe. The other question I can see here, it's just, so how do I determine the frequency of performing assessments of the configuration of an application?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the way we would look at that is to see how we're doing assessments, perhaps periodic reviews of our applications in general, and look at the frequency of those. And you should have an overall procedure that says, declares what the frequency will be. So it's predetermined from that standpoint. That being said, depending on which application we're talking about, if you have an audit trail review such that you can see any changes to the configuration, and that's part of your normal business process, then perhaps you could look at that as a way to reduce the frequency of doing those assessments. But again, you have to look sort of application by application and where you might have some overlap for existing reviews to see where you're doing that. But at a minimum, you need to have it in a procedure to make sure you're making an assessment, and whether that's annually or more or less frequently than that really depends on the risk that application poses to your overall business process.
Right, great. Let's just move to the next question. Joe, can you provide more detail as to what is meant by robust scripted testing and how does it differ from limited scripting?
Sure. So robust scripted testing is kind of, as we said before, a bit of the conventional modality of doing testing. So really what we're doing there is a formal scripted testing that is pre-approved and traces back to requirements and has evidence of repeatability and auditability for a second reviewer to come through and work through what is documented and be able to kind of reproduce the same result. Limited scripting incorporates that too, but it also brings into account other modalities for features that are not high risk. So robust scripted testing applies across the board, but when we think about limited scripted testing, what we're thinking about is the high-risk features, as suggested by the guidance, should follow that robust approach. But in a limited way, we can look at other ways to test, and that can be through sometimes ad hoc testing. So where we just have a process where we just kind of work through the information and kind of use some expert guidance with that too. To the same extent, you can also use a technique called error guessing, where you sort of have a hunch where things might not work very well based on what you're changing, and you kind of look into it from that standpoint too. And I think I kind of linked to this a little before, but also exploratory testing, where it's a bit spontaneous, but you use kind of your existing knowledge to check the system. The important point to point out here, though, is this is still to be documented, right? So even though it's not pre-approved, you do pre-approve what you're trying to challenge with the system. What you're not doing is scripting exactly the path you will take to get there. You're using an expert to walk through the system, and then they document their as found results because those features are lower or medium risk, so that's an acceptable approach.
Right, thank you. We have time for one more question as we're running out of time here. So, Joe, another question for you is, let me see which one to pick. So are electronic signatures and electronic records the same thing as an impact assessment?
Yeah, so I think I shared electronic records, electronic signatures assessment, and we're talking about an impact assessment. So typically, sometimes these things are linked. An impact assessment generally defines whether or not the way an application is used falls in the scope of in what the way we think of it in either GMP or GLP circles. And so it kind of tells us whether or not we need to follow the regulations under that guidance, right? Within that, then, if we have an application that we decide is we're going to collect electronic records with and store them, then we take a further step and we do an electronic records assessment to see where the application complies with that, and also what electronic signatures are utilized, and if they're in compliance with, as I shared before, some of that earlier guidance.
Perfect. Right. Thank you again, Joe, for your time today. And we also like to thank LabRoots and our sponsor, Thermo Fisher Scientific, for underwriting today's educational webcast. And we didn't have time to answer all the questions, so don't worry, for all these questions, they will be addressed by the speaker, by the contact information you provided at the time of registration. And also, I would like to remind you that this webcast can also be viewed on demand. So LabRoots will alert you via email when this is available for a replay. And then if you have anyone in your organization that you think would benefit from watching this webinar on demand, please share the link with them. And before we go, I would like to thank the audience for joining us today and for all your interesting questions. And take care, everyone, and goodbye.